Alright, so today we're going to talk about whether or not Chris Watts is actually a narcissist or a psychopath. We're going to start with narcissism. Covert narcissism, to be specific. So, subclinical narcissism is a brand of narcissism that a lot of people have who would not be diagnosed with the full-blown clinical personality disorder. Right, so the full-blown clinical personality disorder, someone would only be diagnosed with that if they were in an extremely debilitating condition, right? If their life is severely upended by this personality disorder, they might actually get diagnosed with the clinical personality disorder. But what a lot of people say is there are a lot of people with these kind of traits that aren't necessarily in the full blown clinical camp, but they're maladaptive enough that we need their own special label for them because it's maladaptive to the point where we should probably have a label, but it's not clinically to the point where a diagnosis would be warranted. So that's what a lot of people say Chris Watts has, the subclinical variety of narcissism. What a lot of people mean by covert narcissism, what I've come to understand, is there's two different types of narcissists, right? You have the overt narcissist, the Donald Trump type person, and then you have the covert narcissist who is much more secretive about their narcissism, even though that's really not true. What these people I've heard tend to look like is they do a lot of charity. They like to make themselves look good by donating to charity, by doing a lot of volunteer work. And if you were to know this type of person behind the scenes, they might, after a long time of knowing them, say to you, I never tell anyone this, but actually I'm pretty smart. Actually, I'm a really good person. Nobody really talks about it. I don't talk about it much, but I'm telling you the secret. I'm actually a really good person. I'm really smart. I have all these things going on, whatever. That is the typical covert narcissism that I've heard of online. So that's what a lot of people say Chris has, because he's obviously not the Donald Trump type. They say that because he did all these terrible things during the murders, he must have some kind of narcissism, and we can see signs of it in his behavior after the murders. So let's slap on the covert narcissism, since that's probably the best bet, since it's so covert. Anyone can be diagnosed with it because it's so covert. If you have just a few little traits here and there every once in a while, we can slap on narcissism for you and just say it's covert and say secretly in the dark you're narcissistic. So that's what people do to Chris Watts. And then you also have communal narcissism, which is basically just another gotcha. Doesn't actually mean anything, isn't supported by research. It's a made up category and it's pseudoscience. It's just another brand of narcissism in many other brands. So, narcissism in general. I'm not sure if this is based on research or not, but we have the 3 E's of narcissism. A lot of people talk about this. You have exploitation, empathy impairment, and entitlement. So those are the three most common traits that a lot of people like to talk about. And yeah, from the clinical perspective, a lot of this is probably consistent with what you would hear clinically. But we'll talk about what narcissism is, how it's most often talked about in my experience and clinically, and we'll try to compare and contrast these 3 E's versus the clinical, my understanding of the clinical understanding of it. So the big question, number 1, is Chris Watts a narcissist? No, he's not. So there is no evidence of narcissistic behavior whatsoever prior to the affair. So prior to his 33rd birthday, absolutely no evidence whatsoever. You can say, oh, well, there was this one time, then there was this one time there that might have been a trait. No. If someone is narcissistic, that's a personality defect. Personality is very pervasive. If we're going to say someone has this horrible personality issue that contributed to a triple homicide, we need to see significant, pervasive evidence of it in their personality well before the affair, and it needs to be thorough enough. It needs to be thick enough. There has to be enough evidence that a reasonable person who's well informed on this would say, yeah, there's a really strong pattern of behavior here that is definitely leaning towards narcissism. That's very consistent with narcissism, and we don't see that here. We see maybe one instance here, one instance there. It's not a pattern of behavior. It's not pervasive. It's not significantly maladaptive. Certainly not clinically maladaptive, but it's not substantial. Okay, so this conclusively rules out any form of substantive narcissism. Okay, but wait a second. Everyone says here he was a super sneaky covert narcissist. Nope, that's not how it works. Narcissism is a pervasive condition. Putting the word covert in front of it doesn't negate that. So, do I really even know what it is? Maybe, maybe not. I'll let you decide. So, what I've been taught about narcissism is that it is a coping strategy that very young children often learn. Often as young children, not older children. These children learn to use this coping strategy, narcissism, in order to get the attention and love they need from their primary attachment figures. So we have a situation where a young child, when they're still developing attachment, they're not getting the love and support they need. And so they learn, because of the behavior of their parent figure or their guardian figure, they learn that the best way to get the love and support they need is by using narcissism, is by projecting a false grandiose image of themselves. They learn that by being like a really great person, by being a winner, by being better than everyone else, they learn that by doing that, they can get the love and attention that they need. And when that continues to be successful over years and years, this compounds and compounds to the point where you have an adult who only knows how to get the love and attention they need through narcissism, through that coping strategy. So this appears to stem from severe attachment trauma or severe attachment insufficiency early in childhood. So this is not minor scratches, this is severe trauma. Right now I'm talking about the clinical variety, the subclinical variety not as much. So this coping mechanism is an act they perform throughout their entire lives, where they hide behind a paper version of themselves that looks smarter, better, more good-looking, sexier, and more successful than their true selves. So what they do is they have, say this marker here is the real person, right? What they do is they draw an image of themselves that is bigger and better than their true selves, right? And what they do is they hide behind that false grandiose image and they say that's the real me. And then when people say things to them that aren't necessarily insulting, but if they interpret it as an insult, what happens is let me get my knife out again. What happens is they throw a rock at the person's false persona, right? And any small, tiny rock, this persona is extremely thin and fragile. So any pebble, any too strong breeze really will tear a hole in it, right? So someone insults the narcissist, and now all of a sudden we have this massive hole in the narcissist's false persona. So the narcissist is angry. That's what narcissistic rage often comes from. This one little hole, they experience that like this. Okay? That is clinical narcissism. You say one little thing about them, and all of a sudden their entire false persona is like that. So that's why they get so angry. So that's how they cope in the world, is through projecting that false grandiose image. So when people insult them, even in the most insignificant way, a rock is thrown at their false paper persona and it tears a big hole in it. And that hurts this person. It really hurts. It's extremely damaging to their ego, and they require their ego in order to get what they need, in order to get the emotional support that they need. So damaging that is really detrimental to them internally. So when interacting with someone who truly suffers from clinical narcissism, or NPD, that's the abbreviation, they suddenly find out that the sufferer is extremely angry at them for something they said when they didn't even realize what they said was damaging to the sufferer's ego. So these people feel tortured when they perceive that someone has slighted them. Their rocks really hurt. So that's clinical narcissism, but the basic idea of that, the basic principle, applies to the subclinical varieties as well. So again, is Chris Watts a narcissist? Chris Watts' behavior appears to be extremely inconsistent with all known forms of narcissism. All evidence that could be construed as narcissism occurs after his 33rd birthday. Now, there are some traits that Chris has exhibited after his 33rd birthday relating to the affair, relating to the triple homicide, that can be reasonably construed, reasonably interpreted as narcissism. But because we don't have virtually any evidence of this at all whatsoever before his 33rd birthday, before this affair started, we can conclusively rule out narcissism. We can conclusively state that Chris Watts is not a narcissist. And that is like 99% certain. There is absolutely no grounds for the claim that he's a narcissist, because narcissism is pervasive throughout all of life. It doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. So now, psychopathy, also known as antisocial personality disorder. So when people say psychopathy, sometimes they mean someone who doesn't, have empathy. I think that's the most common interpretation, the most common use. Person doesn't have any empathy whatsoever. They're completely free to harm people as much as they want. That means they're a psychopath. They don't have empathy. Now, clinically, this is associated with antisocial personality disorder in the DSM-5, the APA in America. There's no clinical category, no clinical diagnosis for psychopathy. That's not in there. So they say that antisocial personality disorder is basically psychopathy. So I'll start with this. I personally don't know a lot about this disorder. I haven't studied it as much as I have narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. But I have studied it enough that I can make these slides and talk about it for a few minutes. So this is, again, a pervasive pattern that must start well before the 33rd birthday. So this isn't something that can just pop up when you're 30. It's not something that just pops up and then goes away. No, this is a pervasive condition that should be evident throughout your entire life, basically. So Chris has never reported feelings of not experiencing normal emotions like everyone else. That's relevant because we've heard a lot of things from Chris about himself, and we haven't heard that, and we would expect to hear that from someone who actually has antisocial personality disorder. And we know that because this is how people with antisocial personality disorder describe themselves. They say, I don't feel like I have emotions like everyone else. I've always felt different, yada, yada, yada. We don't hear that from Chris. So no one has ever reported getting a creepy feeling around him. I'm not sure how scientific that is, but a lot of people say that when they're around psychopaths, they get like a sixth sense that tells them this person is creepy, stay away. I don't know if there's science behind that. If someone can let me know in the comments, that would be great. But I will note that no one has said that about Chris, and a lot of people have said that about a lot of other, familicide perpetrators and psychopaths, confirmed psychopaths like serial killers. Haven't seen that about Chris. Now, to be fair, evidence of, or lack of evidence, is not evidence of absence. So you have to keep that in mind. But I will continue to note when we don't see things that we should expect to see, and we don't see that, and we should expect to see that.
So we have no evidence of intensely disagreeable phase during childhood, and his mother claims he was a virtually perfect child. When clinicians go about diagnosing antisocial personality disorder, one of the top things they have to do, one of the most important things they have to do, is they have to look at childhood. A lot of these symptoms of antisocial personality disorder must appear before the age of 15 for a diagnosis to be made, per the DSM-5, for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. A lot of those symptoms have to do with reckless disregard for the safety of others, reckless disregard for the safety of self, a lot of criminality, breaking rules. This is one of the disorders where it's not just a stereotype for people to be rule breakers, getting in trouble with the law, getting in trouble at school a lot. That is clinical criteria. In order to make that diagnosis, you have to have a lot of evidence of that before the age of 15. And what we see in Chris is nothing of the sort. There is absolutely no evidence of this disagreeable phase that we expect to see. Now, this information is coming from the mother and from the family, so we do have to consider the possibility that they're kind of fluffing things up a little bit. But in order to assert that Chris Watts has psychopathy or that he has antisocial personality disorder, we must have that evidence. We don't have that evidence, so it is irrational and improper to assert this matter. Okay? So his high agreeableness is extremely inconsistent with psychopathy, ASPD, antisocial personality disorder. His parents reported he was a sweet, inquisitive, shy young child, much like Bella, not the expected disobedient, unruly, rude, smartass bully who always broke the rules. So the archetype that his parents report that he mirrored in his childhood is extremely inconsistent with what we would expect to see if someone actually had this disorder. Third bullet, that may be a stereotype, but those traits happen to be diagnostic criteria for ASPD. ASPD is associated with high criminality since the age of 15, and this must be met for diagnosis. Now, yes, we're talking about clinical diagnosis here. There probably is a similar subclinical variety of ASPD, but because we have absolutely no evidence of any of this type of behavior and actually evidence of the opposite, I find it very irrational to conclude or to assert that he must have this personality disorder or any subclinical variety of it. So we also have to have pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others. We have no evidence of that whatsoever before 33rd birthday, and the behavior during the affair, during the triple homicide, that's not a pattern. That's not a pattern. I mean, you have the pattern during the Limerence affair of not engaging with your family, but that is consistent with Limerence, and we cannot say that it's being caused both by Limerence and by ASPD. The simplest option has to be the one we assume to be correct in this case, because we haven't established any other evidence of ASPD, and there's plenty of evidence of Limerence affair. So, impulsivity and failure to plan. There is no evidence of impulsivity or failure to plan in Chris. Yes, Shanann appeared to be the dominant one who was in charge of all these things, but we don't have evidence of impulsivity. The main issue here is not necessarily we have evidence that he is not. The issue is the evidence we need to make this diagnosis is not there. The next one, deceitfulness. We don't have evidence of deceitfulness, at least not a pattern of deceitfulness. I know someone in the comments said my comment got erased or something, where they apparently listed a bunch of examples of deceitfulness prior to the murders and the affair, but I'm not even sure when those happened or what the evidence those happened is. But I haven't seen any evidence of a pattern of pervasive deceitfulness before the affair. So I have to conclude that that's not there either. You also have to have lack of remorse, consistent irresponsibility, onset before age 15, and reckless disregard for safety of others and self. None of that is here. So, is Chris Watts a psychopath? No. And I know that apparently some FBI profiler said he is. I don't give a shit. So, a common myth. The myth states there are two types of people in the world: those who react to stress with outward anger and those who react to stress by bottling it all up. People who bottle it all up in rare conditions can just snap. And one day, all of a sudden, they're shooting up a grocery store because someone cut them off in traffic. Meanwhile, the person who reacts to stress with outward anger is yelling at the cashier. So we have this dichotomy. Two people, one person is really calm, really relaxed, really agreeable, and they just bottle up all of their stress over the course of their entire life, and then all of a sudden, one day, they just explode, and it's horrible. It's completely unexpected. Nobody saw it coming. They're like a super agreeable, nice person, and then all of a sudden, a nuclear bomb goes off. That's not real. That's not how it works. In reality, people who have no history of snapping, they don't just snap. The people who get so angry that they black out and just start swinging, those people have a long history of that type of behavior. The people who actually snap and go nuclear explosion, they always have a history of this type of behavior. Now, it escalates over time gradually, usually, but it's never completely all off your entire life, never a single incident, and then all of a sudden nuclear. No, that's not real. That's a myth. So, highly agreeable, conflict-avoidant people may bottle up stress over time, but they don't suddenly snap without a prior pattern of this type of volatility. Patterns tend to continue. Trends tend to continue. So criminality tends to be escalatory in nature. Perpetrators of familicide do tend to have clean criminal histories, but they do not tend to lack a pattern of physical and verbal abuse. So familicide is sort of different in this regard, in that you do oftentimes have people with no criminal history. They don't necessarily have a pattern of getting in trouble with the law. However, that does not mean that they don't have a pattern of some kind of violent abuse that escalates and escalates and escalates up until the murders. And this oftentimes is physical violence toward the victim. Despite lacking criminal records, they do tend to have a record of, I just said that, a huge snap is preceded by many smaller snaps that gradually grow into the big final snap. A single isolated mega snap is a made-up thing that doesn't really happen. So no, Chris Watts is not a psychopath. So the next thing we're going to talk about is PTSD. Does Chris Watts have PTSD? I've heard, I think one person suggest this, a pretty reputable person. My opinion is that there's no evidence, but lack of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially since we have extremely little information on his presentation after what was almost certainly by far the most traumatic event of his life. So we'll go through the PTSD criteria super quick. I don't have a lot of information on his behavior after this severely traumatic event, so my ability to properly assess this is very limited. But that being said, I will go through some of the criteria. So the criteria for PTSD is kind of complicated. You have criterion A, criterion B, and C, I believe. He definitely meets criterion A for sure because we have witnessed death and we're directly exposed to death, so criterion A is fine. And I'm pretty sure the rest of the stuff that is like the bullet point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pretty sure that's criterion B. I don't have the actual DSM in front of me. I just have my notes. So I'll just read these out real quick. It is observed that Chris did not show signs of exaggerated startle response in any of the videos we have. It is observed that Chris does not show any indications of experiencing a state of unnaturally heightened arousal or hypervigilance. It is observed that Chris appears to have a slightly blunted affect, but without audio before and after is specified trauma. It is unclear if this is his baseline or if it is the result of trauma. So the reason I say it that is I don't have a lot of audio or video of Chris before, I guess, Thrive, when Shanann made all the Facebook videos. So if someone is going to posit that there was a traumatic event when he was, say, 20 years old that caused PTSD, I can't go back and look at his behavior before that at age 19 and say, okay, there was definitely a change in his affect. My best guess is that his affect at the time of the Facebook videos is his baseline, at least as represented by those videos. So it's unreasonable to conclude that this slightly blunted affect would be the result of PTSD. I've not observed any signs of irritability, depression, or hopelessness in Chris, so we're going back to the very low neuroticism that we talked about in Big Five. That's not consistent with PTSD. I've not observed any avoidance behaviors in Chris. There's a long paragraph there. I'll probably put in the description. Excuse me. So memory loss. Chris does not report any significant memory loss. So in PTSD, we may expect to see acute memory loss that affects certain details of a traumatic event, but we don't expect there to be like huge gaps in memory. We expect there to be very small gaps, detail here and there, maybe like a few minutes that we forget or 30 seconds we forget, not like an entire like 12-minute long event. We don't see evidence of any of that I'm aware of. Inability to construct a linear narrative of one's life. I think this is really more in line with CPTSD, complex PTSD, but we don't appear to see that, at least at the time of the polygraph, because if I remember correctly, I know I've listened to the entire polygraph at least once, and she asks him a lot about like his linear life story narrative, right? Like, where did you grow up? And then over the course of like 3 hours, we end up getting to present day and go through his entire life. I don't recall any evidence of that inability to construct a linear narrative, so I'm going to say that's not met. So nightmares and intrusive thoughts. We don't have a lot of information on this. There was a claim that Chris made in the prison interview where he said he has a lot of nightmares, but these nightmares need to be about real events that actually occurred. And there's a lot of speculation on whether or not anything he said in that interview was factually correct for a lot of reasons, and I'll probably end up making a video on that. But I'm going to say this is not met because, you know, some nightmares are to be expected, but we have to determine whether or not these nightmares are clinically relevant or if they're just normal elements of the human experience, because, you know, it's normal to have nightmares. We have to determine whether or not it's like the same nightmare occurring over and over and over again about this one traumatic event, or if it's the usual number of nightmares. Like, is this clinically relevant to PTSD diagnosis, or is this just something really crappy happened and I keep having nightmares about it? You know, there's a difference there, and I certainly haven't seen any evidence that we've jumped that gap. So dissociation, Chris does not appear to suffer from dissociation of any kind. No observations were made of zoning out, 1,000-yard stare, or freezing. And Chris is not, to my knowledge, reported feeling outside his body, and is not, to my knowledge, reported lost time or coming to in a place not knowing how he got there. So this is, again, back to that common theme of there's a lot of things we need to prove, or that we need to observe directly, this isn't law, in order to make this diagnosis, and we've had ample opportunity to do that if opportunity existed, or if these elements actually existed. We don't see it, so we can reasonably conclude that there's no good reason to make this diagnosis. So back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so the next one, ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, and slash Asperger's. That I'm pretty sure they're both the same disorder now in the DSM in America. Yeah, it's all under ASD now, Autism Spectrum Disorder. So as it pertains to Chris, there's no clear evidence of that specific type of symptomatology in his adult life. A lot of people make the mistake of associating social awkwardness immediately with autism spectrum disorder or with Asperger's or any of those flavors. Autism is a very distinct pattern of behavior that cannot be refined, that cannot be simplified to social awkwardness, okay? So reports of his childhood, however, seem to be consistent with this diagnosis. Reports specifically from his sister saying, I forget what exactly she said, I don't remember exactly where I heard this or read this, but she did name ASD herself, so that's noteworthy. And she said that, I believe she said that she found it difficult to hold conversation with him when he was a small child. She was his older sister. She said she found it difficult to hold conversation with him unless they were talking about a very specific subject that he enjoyed. That specific thing is very consistent with autism. So for that reason, and because she's specifically named autism, I mean, normally I wouldn't just take someone's word for it. But because we have those two things, I think it's reasonable to suspect that he may have had autism earlier in life, because I know that there are some cases where ASD can present in childhood, but it fades away as the person enters into adulthood and like teenage years. So it's possible that he did have this pattern of behavior before he became an adult, but I don't see any evidence of that in his behavior as it presents around the time of the murders and in any of the Facebook videos. So inconclusive, but probably not currently suffering from ASD because we don't have that very distinct pattern of behavior. And once again, ASD is not social awkwardness, maybe a little bit of sensitivity, wearing the same clothes every day. That's not just the property of autism, right? There's a lot of other things that can be going on, normal and abnormal, that could explain that behavior. Social awkwardness is basically nothing, because the way a child is socialized is a very active thing. It's not the case that children just automatically become socialized. It's a process that you need to start, complete successfully in order to not be socially awkward. Just lack of proper social skills is not evidence of any pathology or any clinical disorder whatsoever. So I don't see any reason to conclude that he has autism. And that's the end of the PowerPoint. So what we talked about today is this common theme that keeps occurring over and over and over again that says, we need evidence XYZ, or really the whole alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I can't see the alphabet right now, whatever. We need a lot of stuff in order to make these diagnoses, right? And we're not seeing any of it. What we are seeing just doesn't cut it. We keep seeing this over and over and over again in Chris. We have all this stuff people want to diagnose him with, and what we're doing is if you watched my other video about how not to diagnose Chris Watts, what those people are doing is they're just grabbing candy bars, they're cherry picking, They're not taking their vitamins. They're not just putting a blindfold on and just pick up whatever your hand grabs, right? We need to, when we're diagnosing someone, we need to take in all the evidence. We need to follow the rules of diagnostics. And we need to assess whether or not, one, is this
is this stuff clinically relevant? Is this actually rising to the level of clinical maladaptiveness, basically? And in the case of Chris, there is absolutely no evidence of any clinically maladaptive behavior before age 33, and that effectively rules out basically everything that everyone has claimed that he has conclusively. So that's that.